As our brother Frank alluded to in his scripture reading this morning, the importance of setting the cornerstone right is essential for building. Now, if you don't set the cornerstone right, what will happen to your structure? It'll be crooked. It'll be compromised. The reality is that the structure could fall down prematurely if the cornerstone is not set well. And, there are times where some people get lazy, or they think they don't have to follow conventional building patterns. And they don't set the cornerstone, or they overlook that important piece of building anyways. And what happens is that the building will not last as long as it should have. That was something that was apparent when I had the opportunity to go to Cameroon almost 20 years ago in 2005. We noticed a lot of buildings that had been started but were not finished because of structural damage. And they either ran out of money or they didn't set the cornerstone and lay the foundation correctly. And in the building process, as more and more weight was added to that structure, the structure became compromised. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 8, this is going to be our main text this morning. Peter presents Jesus as a cornerstone. So this section is what we would call a metaphor. A metaphor is a comparison between two objects that are not the same. Okay? So this is a comparison between Jesus and a cornerstone. But Jesus is a cornerstone, as Peter describes here in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. And what we find as we come to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 8, is that there are two responses that every individual has to Jesus Christ, the cornerstone. There are only two responses that people have to Jesus Christ, who is the cornerstone. Now, some will find the cornerstone to be of great value. They will see the importance of the cornerstone, and they will want to build upon that cornerstone. They'll say, I need that. I need this foundation in my life. But there are others who will come to this cornerstone. They will see the importance and they understand the importance of the cornerstone, and they say, I do not want that. And for them, the cornerstone is not of great value. It becomes a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. So let's understand Peter's train of thought through this particular passage. First, let's begin answering this question. Who is the cornerstone? Who is the cornerstone? 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 4. And coming to him as to a living stone. We have at the very beginning of verse 4 a connection to the previous verses. And in these previous verses, the identification of the cornerstone is made. So look with me at verse 3, okay? 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 3. If you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. The pronoun him in verse 4 refers back to the main noun, Lord, in verse 3. Now, this word Lord is representative of Jesus Christ. How do we know that? Well, if you were to go to the Old Testament, you would see the word Lord appear frequently, but it's in all capital letters. And that is actually a reference to the personal name of God, Yahweh. Okay? Now, Jesus is God. Jesus is Yahweh. But here in the New Testament, we find a little bit different distinction. In the New Testament, Jesus refers to himself as Lord, meaning master. He is the master of those who follow him. And in the epistles, in particular, we find Paul, Peter, John using the word Lord to apply to the person of Jesus Christ. And they use terms like God and Father when they are referring to God the Father. And they use a word like Spirit or Holy Spirit when they refer to the Holy Spirit. And since we understand that as the background, when we come to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 3, and we see, you have tasted the kindness of the Lord, this is the kindness not necessarily of God the Father, but it is specifically of Jesus Christ. Jesus has been kind to us, and we have tasted of His kindness if we have been saved with the salvation that He provides. So we identify the cornerstone as Jesus Christ. Now, Peter goes on to say in verse 4 that Jesus is a living stone. Now, how could He be a living stone? Stones are not living objects. Well, understand the metaphor. He is a stone, and He is a living stone. As a stone, He provides a foundation for something to be built upon. And we understand from our study of the Scripture that the foundation Jesus provides is a foundation of faith. The author of Hebrews in chapter 12 says this, Jesus was the author and the perfecter of faith. And so that's what Jesus, as a cornerstone, is laying the foundation for. That's what He stands as the foundation of. And He is not a dead stone, He is a living stone. Why? Because He was raised from the dead. He did die, but He was raised from the dead on the third day by the power of God, showing that God accepted His sacrifice to pay the price for all the sins of all mankind. And so Jesus is the cornerstone. Jesus is the living stone. And Peter goes on to talk about he goes on to talk about the response that people have to this cornerstone. Verse 4, and coming to Him as to a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. We see immediately that there are two responses to the cornerstone. In the sight of God, He is choice and precious. That means He has great value. But in the sight of some men, He has been rejected. So let's explore not the rejected portion. We will get to that in a moment. But let's explore the value of the cornerstone. And we understand the value of the cornerstone by understanding the nature of the cornerstone. You see, God is the one who thought Him to be choice and precious. The word choice is actually the Greek word that is translated elect. So I had Frank read from the New American Standard Version, and then also from the English Standard Version, because I felt in my own studies that the English Standard Version laid out this distinction more clearly than the New American Standard. And if you have an ESV, you'll see that in verse 4 it says, is chosen and precious, versus choice and precious. And I think that continues this idea, this theological concept that Peter has been developing from the very beginning of this book, that God elects, God makes choices, and then God has the power to bring those choices into fruition. And that's why I like the ESV rendition of this particular verse. God chose Jesus to be the cornerstone. God doesn't leave anything to chance, and God also has the power, because of His sovereign might, to bring all of His decisions into fruition. How do we know this? Well, if we take a step back from the New Testament and we just look at the Bible as a whole, there are between 200 and 400 Old Testament prophecies made about the Messiah. Alfred Edersheim, who was a well-known Jewish scholar in the 1800s, converted to Christianity, and he identified 456 Old Testament verses that speak directly or indirectly to Messiah in the New Testament. And Jesus fulfilled every single one of those prophecies. In my research this week on this, some count the number of prophecies as low as 196. Some count it as high as 338. But at any course, the fact that he fulfilled just one of the prophecies is incredible, let alone 196 or 338. The odds of that are mathematically astronomical. One of the websites I was on gave you the odds, but I don't even want to repeat it because I'm so bad at math, I couldn't even get that right. Okay? All you need to know is that God the Father chose Jesus to be the cornerstone, and he placed him in Zion, we'll get to this in just a moment, at the exact right moment in human history that he wanted to place him there. And then he says this about the cornerstone. The cornerstone is precious. He is chosen and precious in the sight of God. Now, this word precious is used 3 times in these 4 or 5 verses to describe Jesus. It's used in verse 4, it's used in verse 6, and it's used in verse 7. Precious is something that has exceeding value, something that is highly treasured. And the value of something that is precious is almost a number that you wouldn't even dare to speak out loud. Think about it. How precious are your children? Is there a number that you could place on the life of your child? And maybe some of you are like, yeah, I could go with a number. But grandchildren are totally precious. You could never place a number on the life of a grandchild, okay? That's the word that God says describes his son. He is precious. You cannot even place a value. You cannot place a number on that value. And when we think about how precious this is, we see in verse 6 that God placed this cornerstone in Zion. Look at verse 6. This is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. So God is the one who placed this cornerstone in Zion. And what could God do to demonstrate his love more greatly than to give purposefully this precious stone to those whom he loves? What could he do greater than that? I submit to you there's nothing. And in fact, the most well-known verse in the entire world says the same thing. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave what? His only unique Son. And so here we find the exact same concept. God, the word in my English Bible says lay in Zion, but you could read it placed. God stood it there. God put in Zion a cornerstone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. This cornerstone is undoubtedly Jesus Christ. And Zion, if you don't know, is a reference to the city of Jerusalem, which is the city of David. This is the place where the Jews had built the temple where God dwelt and was the center of worship for all of Israel. In fact, the temple was the only place that the Jews knew how or where to worship. That's where all the worship was carried out. And when God placed Jesus in Zion as a cornerstone, it was a signal that worship was changing, that a new system was being inaugurated. We were moving from the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Law Covenant, which gave the rules and regulations for the temple, to a new covenant, one that would be made in the blood of Jesus Christ himself. And so we find this prophecy in the Old Testament about God preparing to replace the Mosaic Law covenant with a new covenant, and that covenant would be built on a precious cornerstone, who is Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus understood that this was his mission. You remember, I believe it was in John chapter 2, he referenced the temple in Jerusalem, and he made a play on words. He said, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." And the religious leaders got very angry with him. And what did they say? "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to build it back up in 3 days?" Well, what was John's commentary after the fact? He wasn't speaking of the physical, literal temple there in Jerusalem. He was speaking of the temple of his body, which would be destroyed on the cross, and then 3 days raised from the dead again by the power of God. This cornerstone, who is Jesus Christ, is the foundation for a new spiritual house for God. And we call that the church. It is the church. And so now we've identified who the cornerstone is. And we need to now look at, well, what about those people who find value in the cornerstone? And what about those people who find it to be a rock of offense? Because there are only two responses to Jesus Christ, the man. You either believe in him or you reject him. And so for those who find value in the cornerstone, Peter says that you will become living stones. Look with me at verse 5, okay? You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual houses acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. This precious value, then, is for you who believe. So if you believe, you will not be disappointed. What does that mean? How is Peter using this Old Testament quote? He who believes in him will not be disappointed? Well, the entire first chapter of the book of 1 Peter describes how you will not be disappointed if you place your faith in Jesus. What does Peter say? Just look at chapter 1 with me. Look at chapter 1. What does Peter say? In verses 1 and 2, if you are saved, you have been saved by the great and powerful plan of God. In verses 3 through 9, Peter says that you will have an eternal inheritance that will not fade, that is imperishable and totally pure. He also says that you will have a home in heaven where Jesus and God dwell. And then finally, in verse 9, Peter makes the point that your salvation is secure. Verse 9 of chapter 1. Obtaining as the outcome of your faith the salvation of your souls. If you place your faith in Jesus, God, by his mighty power, will protect it until the time when God completes the work of salvation for you. And that is what we call glorification. That's the final state of the believer, glorification. And so when Peter uses this quote from Isaiah, he who believes in him will not be disappointed, he's expecting his readers to remember all the benefits of salvation that they find in chapter 1. You won't be disappointed if you place your faith in this cornerstone. Furthermore, you will be a living stone. Why will you be living? Why will you be living? There's a lot of analogies that we could draw from what Peter says. But I think the two most obvious ones are, if Jesus was killed and then brought back to life from the dead, if he was resurrected from the dead, we too no longer have to fear death. We will live even though we die. And that's talking about the physical death that we will one day experience, most likely, unless Jesus comes back while we're still alive. But most likely we will experience that physical death. But after that physical death, we will go on living in the presence of God and Jesus Christ for all eternity. Another way that you are a living stone is that your heart of stone that you had prior to salvation was turned into a heart of flesh. So there's a total regeneration that goes on there. And there are a lot of word pictures that Peter uses that we can unpack to understand the weight of truth that Peter is just piling on his readers. I mean, he's just piling it on and piling it on and piling it on. All of these metaphors, all of these analogies, Peter is drawing from this one and this one and this one to help you understand that if you find value in the cornerstone, there is great personal benefit in that for you. Great personal benefit. There is also an obligation. Okay, there is personal benefit. You will not be disappointed, but there is also an obligation. And this is what Peter emphasizes in verse 5. If you become a living stone, you will be a building block. If you are a living stone, you will become a building block. Verse 5. You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So living stones are building blocks in that we, who are the individual living stones, are being put together to create a spiritual house where God dwells. So unlike the old covenant temple, which was a structure made of real stones that had real gold, real bronze, real wood, the living stones today are making a spiritual house. And it is the place where God dwells. So we, as living stones, are being built up as the household of God. And, Peter says, we are also a holy priesthood. So there is both a group aspect and an individual aspect of this. Now, the group aspect, being built up as a spiritual house, is something that God does to you. It is in the passive voice, meaning somebody acts upon you to accomplish this task. You're not the one actively building the household of God. You, as a living stone, have been placed into the household of God by God himself. Okay? And this is true because as we looked at the doctrine of salvation, we find it was man who did all the work, right? Wrong. No, God did all the work to result in your salvation. God did all the work, and so therefore, because he did all the work, he is now going to take you and put you in the temple, which Peter's calling here, a spiritual house comprised of all the other living stones, all the other saved. You are being built up with them. And we call that the church. And so here, in this assembly, we have a group of living stones who are built up into a spiritual house. And we are the church right now, and this is the place where God dwells. When you all leave out of here, the Spirit of God doesn't just continue to reside in this building. The Spirit of God is here because you are here. Because the Spirit of God indwells individuals, not a specific location. That's why it feels empty Monday through Friday. Okay? But when you guys come on Wednesday, when you guys come on Sunday, and the living stones are gathered together, that is where the Holy Spirit is dwelling. That's what God is doing for you. That's the group component. Believers are the household of God, but we also are priests who offer up spiritual sacrifices. Now this might be a little bit harder to wrap your mind around. How can we be the household of God and also the priest who offers sacrifices? Maybe it's not hard for us, but it would have certainly been challenging, I think, for the readers in Peter's day. And here's why. The cultural context, the cultural context that Peter was dealing with was one in which every religion had a specific temple. And every religion had priests who served at that temple. So it's not like the Israelites were the only ones who had a temple and priests. No, everybody who worshiped Zeus or Diana or Aphrodite or any of the other Greek gods, they all had temples for their gods. And what did all of those temples have? They all had priests or priestesses who were intermediaries between the worshiper and God. You see, that's the goal, that's the job of a priest. He goes between the worshiper and God. And you can see, if you go back to the Mosaic Law Covenant, how specific God was in the duties and the tasks of the priests. He was extraordinarily clear. He was extraordinarily specific in how you were to receive an animal, how you were to cut an animal, how you were to offer the animal on the offering or on the altar, and which parts of the animal could be offered versus which parts could not be offered. And so there are always regulations, and if you violate any of those regulations, you have broken the connection between the worshiper and God. So there are all these things that need to line up and be done correctly in order to see the priesthood functioning in the way that it should be. Peter's readers would have understood this because they all came out of this type of society. It's harder for us to see that because we don't have temples, we don't have priests. Maybe some of us came out of a tradition that had that, but that's not all of us. And so it's difficult for us to imagine being the temple and then also being the priest, but that's exactly what Peter says we are. And as the priests, we are to actually do something. This is the active role. So passively, you are being built up into the spiritual household. Actively, you are to offer spiritual sacrifices which are acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Okay? What are these spiritual sacrifices? That's a key question. If we're going to be the priests and we are going to offer these sacrifices to God, we need to understand what they are. Now, in the greater context of the book of 1 Peter, I think that 1 Peter spends the remainder of chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4 explaining those spiritual sacrifices. He goes into great detail about the types of lives that we should live, the conduct that we should have, the attitude that we should possess, and the way that we relate not only to governing authorities, but our spouse and other believers. Those are all the spiritual sacrifices that Peter is talking about. So he's going to explain those in the future. And obviously, I'm not going to cover all of those right now. But what I am going to say is that Peter's admonition, his instruction to offer spiritual sacrifices which are acceptable to God, concurs with Paul's command in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, that believers must present themselves as a living and holy sacrifice to God. And what this means is that every aspect of your life should be devoted to God. Every aspect of your life should come under the authority of the Word of God, and you should be seeking to do all to the glory of God. From your diet and exercise habits, to your sleeping habits, to your entertainment habits, to your work habits, to your personal relationships, everything that you do in life should be a spiritual sacrifice to God. There is nothing that is untouched. Nothing. Here's how we do this. Paul writes in Romans 12:2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." And do you want to know how you know the will of God? That's probably one of the most common questions I get asked as a pastor. What's the will of God for my life? And usually I say, one thing that we can look at really obviously is to abstain from sexual immorality. It says that directly. And I believe 1 Thessalonians 4. Abstain from sexual immorality. That's one thing that you can specifically do that is the will of God. It says it. This is the will of God for you. And then usually I go to other passages that say, this is the will of God for you. And I don't think that's what people are looking for. I think they want to know, should they go to this college, or should they buy this house, or take on this job opportunity? And all of those things are important, but they pale in comparison to doing the actual things that God says are His will for your life. Those things will work themselves out. They'll work themselves out. Focus on the major things that God says you should do. And how will you discern the will of God? Well, as my brother, Pastor Keith, preached last week, you will discern the will of God if you know the Word of God. So you may not know what job you're supposed to take, who you're supposed to marry, what college you go to, or career change to make. You may not know some of those things, but what you can know is the Word of God. And that's what Peter emphasizes in verses 1 through 3. Long for the pure milk of the Word. You see, if you long for the pure milk of the Word and you know the Word, then when it's time to offer spiritual sacrifices, you are not going to be confused as to what you should be doing. You're going to have the truths of God deep within your heart. They are going to be controlling your thought patterns. They're going to be controlling your emotions. They're going to be controlling your responses. And then you'll be doing the will of God. You will be offering the spiritual sacrifices that God accepts. Now, it's very important to offer the correct sacrifices. Israel was chastised multiple times in the Old Testament for offering sacrifices incorrectly. Sometimes it was because they had a wrong motivation. Sometimes it was because they brought the wrong animal. Sometimes it was because the worshiper and the priest colluded together to give God least, and they took the best. There's all kinds of ways to mess this up. But if you long for the pure milk of the Word, you'll have the best opportunity to offer the appropriate spiritual sacrifices. What are some examples? Loving your brother, loving your neighbor, sharing the blessings that God has given to you with those in need. You need to be salt and light by representing Christ well in the public sphere, honoring authority, forsaking the sins of your former life. These are all things that are commanded of believers in the New Testament. They're spelled out clearly in the Word. They don't require a Master's of Divinity degree to understand what they mean. You just have to do them. You just have to do them. And you do them whether you feel like it or you don't feel like it. Because when Jesus is Lord of your life, you will obey Him. You will obey Him. And so this is what people who find the cornerstone to be of great value, this is what the people who find the cornerstone to be of great value will do. They are being built up as God's spiritual house, and they will seek to bring glory to Christ through all their actions, from the greatest to the least. Now, that's what happens if you find value in the cornerstone. But what if you come to the cornerstone and you find offense in that? What happens then? Well, Peter begins, as we have already mentioned, verse 4 by saying, some have rejected the cornerstone. This is verse 4. Some have rejected the cornerstone by men. The word reject, it means to find something or someone not worthy or genuine and to then cast them aside. Let me say that again. The word reject means to find something or someone not worthy or genuine, and then as a result of that, you cast them aside. You throw them away. There were some rejects. We had a garage sale this past weekend. We had a bunch, like 10 families brought stuff, and a lot of it got taken away. But there was a lot left. Those are the rejects. Nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted it. Not even for free. We had some people come afterwards. Take what you want. No, don't want it. Not even for free. Think about this definition, though. If you are going to find somebody not worthy or genuine, what have you done? You have placed your own standard as the chief and primary measuring rod. That's what you've done. If you reject something else, your standard is greater than somebody else's standard. And I'm sure that all the people who rejected those items at the garage sale looked at those and thought, man, I have higher standards than that for what I want to put in my house. Well, okay, fine. Whatever. We all have standards. But when it comes to the cornerstone, if you reject the cornerstone, you are saying that your standard is better than God's standard. That you know more than the God who created the heavens and the earth and all that we see. And the word is followed up, rejected by men. This is the general word for mankind used in the Greek New Testament. It includes both men and women. And so there is, in general, a group of people comprised of men and women who place their own standard as more important and more valuable and more trustworthy than God's standard, and then they reject the cornerstone. Peter advances this argument. He builds upon it because in verse 7, he quotes an Old Testament passage again, which identifies more precisely the group of individuals who rejected Christ. Look at verse 7. Look at verse 7. The stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone. Well, who are the builders? You see, we move from the general rejected by men to the stone which the builders rejected. Who are the builders? Well, the builders are actually identified as the chief priests and the religious leaders of Jesus' day. These individuals had the most intimate knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, and yet they rejected the Messiah when God dropped him right in their laps. Jesus makes this identification for us, actually. Look with me at Matthew chapter 21. I want you to see what Jesus says about these men. Now, mind you, Peter was there watching this exchange between Jesus and the religious leaders, and so he copied exactly what Jesus said. And actually, in Peter's public ministry, he makes this argument here in 1 Peter, and he also makes it again in Acts chapter 4. So Peter learned from the Master the identification of these particular individuals. All right. Matthew chapter 21, verse 42. Jesus said to them, this is the chief priests, the Pharisees, the religious leaders. Jesus said to them, did you never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone? And this came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. Now praise God for that. You and I are included in that people because we are Gentiles. We were not the original recipients of the Messiah. We are grafted in, as Paul writes in Romans chapter 11. But verse 44, he who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. When the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, verse 45, they understood that he was speaking about them. And so we go from a general rejection of the cornerstone to a specific group of people who reject the cornerstone. And that is the religious leaders of Jesus' day. And in fact, this was according to God's plan and God's design. For if they had not rejected him, things would have been different. There was a genuine offer of the Messiah to the Jewish people. But because they rejected him, it opened salvation up to all the nations through the blood of Christ. Now, God knew this would happen. God knew this would happen. If you reject the cornerstone will become a stumbling stone. This is Peter's conclusion in verse 8. A stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. That's what the cornerstone has become for those who reject. To stumble means you strike your foot against something and you trip or you fall down. And Peter uses it not in a literal sense of a stone that's on the pathway, but he uses it in a spiritual, figurative sense. That Jesus is a spiritual rock, and those who reject him will trip over it and will stumble spiritually. There is a spiritual stumbling. Furthermore, it is a rock of offense. This Greek word translated offense is the word skandalon. The normal Greek usage of this word is such that it represents a trap or a snare that would be used to trap an animal. Now, when you're trying to trap an animal, you are not, you're trying to hide your trap. You're not trying to make it obvious to the animal that a trap is there. That's why it's a snare or a trap. The animal doesn't know, and then all of a sudden, it trips the trigger and is caught. And it can't get out. But when this word skandalon is used in the New Testament, it's used in a spiritual sense to describe an action that causes someone to fall into sin. And what happens when you fall into sin? One sin is enough to what? Condemn you to an eternity in the place God calls hell or the lake of fire. This is what this word means. And so in one portion of the New Testament, believers are commanded not to put an offense in front of their brother or sister in Christ. Do not ensnare or entrap your brother so that they are stumbling into sin. But in this context, Peter's using this word in such a way that the very person of Jesus Christ is the trap. He is the trap. He is the snare. He is the thing that makes people fall down and stumble. Because they look at him and they say, I can't have that. I reject that. I don't want that. And they stumble in a spiritual sense. They are trapped by their own rejection, by their own unbelief, and they fall down in sin, and they suffer the eternal consequences. And Peter explains how this stumbling occurs. Verse 8, they stumble because they are disobedient to the word. As we have been emphasizing week over week over week, it is the word of God, that is the power of God, that the Holy Spirit uses to cause someone to become saved. It is the word of God. And so when you present Jesus and you do it using the word of God, some people disobey that word and they stumble over the stumbling stone. There is a personal responsibility that Peter is emphasizing here. And he's talking about individuals who reject Christ are personally responsible for their own decisions. And here's what he writes at the very end of verse 8. It's a challenging phrase, and I'm going to try to make it simple. He says, to this they were also appointed. I believe the ESV says, and they were destined for this. All right, now, on the one hand, we could say it sounds like God has destined these people to not believe, and therefore there is no hope for them. But I think that's only an incomplete look. Rather, I would say that the Scriptures present God's offer of salvation as genuine for every person. And if a person is disobedient to the word and rejects God's offer of salvation, there is a certain end that is appointed for them. And they, by stumbling over the cornerstone, will receive that particular end. So we can never overlook the personal responsibility of sinners when it comes to choosing or rejecting the cornerstone. In fact, Paul makes this argument in Romans chapter 1. Men who knew the truth about God have done what? Suppressed the truth, and they have chosen, they made a choice. They have chosen to worship the creature rather than the Creator. And Peter brings this to bear upon this whole argument about the stumbling stone, which is a rock of offense. It's not accidental that somebody stumbles over the stumbling stone. It's purposeful, and it's indicative of a heart that is hardened to God. Now, my question to you is, will you find the cornerstone to be of great value? Or will you find the cornerstone to be a stone of stumbling? I can't pretend to know the spiritual destiny of every person in this auditorium or of every person who might hear this when it gets published on YouTube. But you know whether you have found the cornerstone to be of great value or whether the cornerstone for you has been a stone of stumbling. I would beg with you, if it has been a stone of stumbling for you, do not leave, do not end today without making the cornerstone of great value. Change your mind about the cornerstone. The author of Hebrews says, today is the day of salvation. Today. And if you have found that the cornerstone is of great value, I would implore you, offer up spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God in every area of your life. Find one area where you can do better and work on improving that area this week. Just pick one, this week, one. And then when you begin to master that one, find another one, so that all aspects of your life are bent towards obedience to God's word and towards giving Christ the glory in all things. Let's pray.